and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. This week we're going to take a hard look at an issue that doesn't strictly qualify as macroeconomics, but since it's raising the hackles of so many members of the public, I guess it is a macro issue in some sense. So we're going to take a hard look at the issue of levy of bank charges. Major Indian banks, State Bank of India, ICICI, HDFC and Axis have decided to charge users for cash transactions above certain limits and for some facilities that were free till now. More banks are expected to follow suit. So the issue we're debating is, should banks charge their customers for services rendered, or should they do it gratis since they're enjoying the use of customers' funds? And if it is kosher for them to charge, what should the quantum of charges be? How should they be determined? Should it be left to them, or should the RBI get into the act and prescribe charges? We're going to discuss all this and more with our panel of experts: Asok, Ravat, member All India Depositors Association; G. Padmanabhan, former Executive Director RBI and presently Non-Executive Chairman Bank of India; and Rajnish, Kumar, Managing Director National Banking Group, State Bank of India. Welcome to the show, all three of you. Let me start by asking you, why has this issue suddenly come to the forefront? After all, it's not as if it's something completely new. Foreign and private sector banks have been charging customers for many years now for failure to maintain minimum balances, which are actually pegged quite high as a matter of fact, for issuing checkbooks, for statements of account, for effecting standing instructions, and so on and so forth. So why has the issue suddenly snowballed? Is it because for the first time a public sector bank like SBI is also getting into the act, and there's this enormous sense of entitlement when it comes to public sector banks, which is why the public is up in arms? Is it part of the same culture that has got so used to freebies that it believes municipal bodies, for instance, should provide free water, toll should not be collected for rolls, and so on, without realizing that there's no such thing as a free lunch? Is it not time to change that kind of a mindset? So let me start with you, Mr. Ravat. Why is the All India Depositors Association not willing to accept what should be obvious? There is a cost to every service, and banks are not in the business of charity.
Interpretation that there is opposition to bank service charges is not correct. There is opposition to the banking charges if they are not fair, if they are not reasonable, if they are not appropriate, and if they are not transparent. I think this must be taken into account. If we go back, we will find in 1999, the banks were allowed to charge whatever they could because that was part of the liberalization process. But did the banks follow that perfectly? Did they protect the bank customers' rights? Did they charge reasonable? Did they charge fair? Were they transparent? All these issues came up, and therefore a Sadashivan committee was set up in 2006, which went into the reasonable of banking service charges. And that is the starting point, and we find that in the last 11 years, somehow, in spite of self-regulation, BCSBI being there, the customers are not being charged reasonable for the banking service charges. They are sometimes not transparent, and they are not appropriate also in some cases.
Padmanabhan, would you agree with Mr. Ravat? He mentioned the Sadasivam committee, which went into the issue of bank charges and said they should be reasonable, and also should rules be different for public and private sector banks? After all, it's not only in the case of banks. Take the case of IRCTC, the ticketing and catering arm of the Indian Railways. Post demonetization, government simply told IRCTC that it should waive service charges, never mind what it meant for its finances. But it did not tell the same thing to the airlines. Why do we in India have different rules, and if I may say unfair rules, when it comes to the public sector?
Mythili, precisely. I think let me start by agreeing to one of the aspects which Mr. Ravat pointed out, is that there has to be absolute transparency as to what the customer is required to pay. I think that's a point very well taken. My earlier avatar in Reserve Bank, now as Chairman of the Bank of India, I completely concede that point that there has to be transparency. But it is also to be remembered that today the concept of public sector, private sector in terms of, the various competing with each other and bringing a level playing field, there can no longer be a situation where the public sector banks have a certain set of rules and the private sector banks have a different set of rules. Now, this is where some of the banks, and this has to be seen in the holistic view, that on one side, we are trying to push digitization, there is certain amount of intervention happening as far as digitization is concerned. And on the other side, the way the digitization has to be achieved in this country, we'll have to ensure that there is some kind of disincentivizing as far as cash transactions are concerned. But there has to be some kind of validation whether these charges are too high. But is that to be done by the government or the Reserve Bank of India intervening and granularly mandating these charges? I, for one, never believed in this, even when I was in Reserve Bank of India, and least now, that it must be left to the market. But since the customers are involved, there must be some kind of a validation about the reasonableness. How that is to be achieved, we can debate on that. But then the banks will have to be, and given the fact that I think the charges that Indian banks charge, if you compare with rest of the world, it would be very difficult to come to the conclusion that it's very high. There may be certain things which the banks were not doing in the past, which they have started doing given the changing circumstances and the compulsion. That doesn't mean that prima facie is not acceptable.
Rajnish, do public sector banks feel a little unfairly treated? Is there a sense that rules are different for public and private sector banks?
Yes, I think the perception is that because we are public sector bank, so we are just like any other government utility or department and have no right to charge for anything. We do appreciate and understand the public sentiment, but the fact is that the service charges, particularly relating to the MAB, what you call the minimum monthly average balance, so those charges were there till 12, and then RBI said that you can't charge it, and in November 14, RBI again permitted with certain conditions which are to be met by the bank. And there are a lot of costs which banks incur. There are 2-3 things which a bank or an institution should keep in mind, and this is what we also keep in mind. One is the transparency and disclosures. Whatever you charge, they should be easy to understand, and public should know what are you charging, and there should not be any fine print. That is the first requirement. And second requirement is that any change in the service charges, there should be adequate notice, and in this case we have given a 30 days notice. So I think the charges which State Bank is proposing, they are very moderate. It does not compensate the bank for the entire expenditure it incurs on servicing the accounts, and it is only a part recovery.
Mr. Ravat, is the problem with the very idea of a fee being levied, or is it with the quantum of the fee? I know you said Depositors Association say they are not against charges per se, only that these should be reasonable. But can we ever have agreement on what really is reasonable?
No, I will come to that later on. First, I would like to say something about what Mr. Padmanabhan said. He said about the level playing field. There should be level playing field for the consumer protection also. And if there is no level playing field for consumer protection, the things will go. That means the cash transactions, if they are penalized, I think nobody will agree with that. What should be done is digital transaction should be incentivized, and cash transaction need not be penalized. They can be discouraged, but penalizing them is a different thing. What I am saying that a reasonableness of the service charges is concerned with the cost of the service charges. You should not unnecessarily add at random any charge as a bank service charge. It should be connected with the actual cost of giving that service. Nobody is asking for, in a way, free service. But when we come to basic banking, some of the things are, and it is in the banking system today, that some cash transactions are free. I mean, there can be rethinking about the number of cash transactions, but the basic banking cash transactions are free. Those should remain free for a normal bank deposit holder. We are not talking about class banking, we are also talking about mass banking. That also should be remembered.
Padmanabhan, you mentioned earlier that there is a need to validate these charges. But how would you go about doing that? Because charges would vary enormously from branch to branch, depending on whether you're in the urban area, rural area, metropolitan area.
See, costing these services is an exercise which has to be done. I concede the point that it cannot be an arbitrary number which the banks think through, and every time they have a problem, they try to increase these charges. That is something that I don't think any bank would be would be doing or should be allowed to do, that point is conceded. But let's take the point that Mr. Ravat made about a normal customer. Now, there are certain number of transactions which are already given free. Now, how many of us do more than this number of transactions in a month? So this aspect has already been factored into by the banks or the Reserve Bank of India when they decided about how many free ATM transactions should happen. All this have been reasonably factored in to cover the majority of the customers. Now, I don't completely go along with the point that the only way that we can bring about the digitization is to incentivize digitization. That doesn't happen in any country where we are talking about more than 80% of the transactions happening in cash. So if we are talking about bringing auditability to the transactions, if we are going to bring about non-cash transaction leading to reduction in corruption, etc., which is a big picture which has been drawn out by the government, there has to be some kind of a disincentivization for the cash transactions. Now, to what extent that is to go, that's a matter on which we can debate till the end of the day. But as a principle, I would support that.
Rajnish, you've been quoted earlier also as saying that the decision was taken keeping in mind the costs associated with maintaining savings bank accounts. But why now? What has changed? Because costs, if anything, should have come down with the use of technology.
Technology has definitely brought down the cost. But if I were to again give you an idea, if we service a customer out of a branch, it costs me almost 38 rupees per transaction. If it is my ATM, the cost is almost 10 rupees per transaction. Other banks' ATM, I have said that we have to pay 15 rupees plus service tax. So there is a huge cost on the transaction, and savings bank, as far as the number of transactions goes, I could not lay hand to my passbook when I joined the bank, but there were always restrictions on the transactions, number of transactions which could be done in a savings bank account, because the savings bank account in particular, it is a product which is positioned in between a current account where the interest rate is 0 and between the fixed deposit where interest rate is 6, 6.5% and 7%. On a fixed deposit, once bank has taken a fixed deposit, and after that there is no servicing cost. But for savings bank in particular, the servicing cost is huge, and as I have said that the idea and the intent is not to inconvenience our regular customers. We value and appreciate the deposit franchise, and particularly from our savings bank account holders.
Mr. Rawat, Padmanabhan says that charges are needed in order to desensitize the use of cash. But can that be a justification in a poor country like India, where cash actually plays a very dominant role, especially in the poorer sections of society? Also, now that we move to a market-driven economy, can we expect that charges will not bear some relation to the service rendered? After all, charges at public sector banks are way below those levied by their private sector counterparts. Jan Dhan accounts are excluded, and the customer is in fact free to move. In fact, if you look at interest paid on savings bank accounts, you have banks like Kotak and Yes offering interest of 6 and 7%, whereas SBI offers only 4%. But you seem to be quite okay with that.
Yeah, I think you must divide this into two particular sectors. You mentioned about some private banks giving more interest on saving bank account. But there are some riders to it, that you must have few lakhs of rupees in balance, then you will get that particular interest. What I am also saying is about you must consider about masses, and it is the intention of the central government to see that there is more financial inclusion, more poor people come into the banking system. If that is the objective, and if you penalize cash transactions, I am not talking about the cash transactions which are taking place in order to evade taxes. I am talking about the cash transactions which are necessary because below certain level, digital transactions become costly to operate. And who will bear this cost? And looking at the literacy of the masses, is it possible that everybody will go into the digital transaction and will not handle cash? Because you suppose that you have to make a payment of 10 rupees. Can you make it digitally? Is it really possible? Is it going to be cost effective for the nation? We must consider all these points and arrive at a solution. And if you want mass people to come into the banking system, that is financial inclusion through banking, then we have to take a different view whether we should disincentivize cash transaction or not. That's a different thing altogether. I think central government's objective is clear. Reserve Bank also should be in tune with it, and as a regulator should step in. Mr. Padmanabhan said that as a regulator there is certain things that Reserve Bank cannot do. But this is the thing that the Reserve Bank should do. After certain transactions, if they are cash transactions, to certain extent, the quantity and the value also, I think there has to be a rethink about this, and therefore, further than that, more transactions than that, if there are charges, then they should be reasonable, they should be fair. Of course, he agrees that it should be transparent, and I also say they should be appropriate, because charging first for cash transaction, if they start charging that also, it will be an inappropriate thing, because we must think of mass banking, we must think of financial inclusion. These are the things which we cannot keep an eye shut on this.
Padmanabhan, surely Mr. Ravat is right when he says that such charges go against the very grain of financial inclusion and taking banking to the masses. Also, if I could quote the well-respected Dhirendra Kumar of Value Research, he has been writing extensively against the levy of bank charges. He says, banks debit the customers' accounts unilaterally, unlike in the case of all other service providers, where the service provider first raises a bill and only then the customer pays. And also he says that RBI as a custodian of customer protection must intervene and fix the charges. As a former central banker, would you agree with his contentions?
No, the point with central bank or government intervening in charges is that they always come up with a number which they think is right, which may not be right either for the market or for the customer. That's a problem. Now, I mean, I completely agree. I think we are probably talking the same thing in different ways. What I'm saying is that I think to the point that was made by Mr. Ravat about certain few transactions, I don't think any bank is saying that from the first cash transaction onwards we are going to charge you. There is a certain number of transactions which are going to be given free. And the small value accounts, at least as far as Bank of India is concerned, we are not thinking about charging for the small value accounts. Now, all this have been factored in. Now, having factored in, the question is that whether there should be an external body which should mandate this. Now, are we saying that the banking transaction in this country is a one-way kind of an affair where the banks always rip off the customer? I think having spent nearly 4 decades in the financial sector and most of it is a regulator, I'm sorry, I don't subscribe to that. I think there are a fair bit of transparency and fairness in these transactions. Now, on a number, whether 50 is right or a 60 is right is something that we can argue about. And then if there is very strong opinions on either side, there could be a way in which this can be sorted out, arbitrated. To that extent, I agree. But to say that Reserve Bank or the government should mandate these charges, whether it is for the cash transactions or for the electronic transactions, I always was not having any kind of belief that we would come out with the right number.
Rajnish, can I get you in on that? Should banks have unilateral right to debit the customer's account?
I don't think so that it is unfair to the customers, and raising bill for everything, I don't think that is feasible also. But as I have said, that when we have disclosed to the customer and advised and disclosed it not only through website, but say for example this particularly this monthly average balance thing. So if people don't maintain, say for example we have introduced this charge from 1st April. And the people who don't have the monthly average balance during the month of April, on 1st May, we will be sending a notice individually and tell them that this is our scale of charges, and in May you can restore the balance whatever is required by the bank, and if they restore, then there is no charge. So enough opportunity and communication and individual notices will have to be given either through by email, SMS or by way of a letter if SMS or email address is not available.
Mr. Rawat, consumer organizations have been threatening to find a PIL. Apart from the fact that this seems a gross misuse of PILs, is there even a prima facie case to do that?
Well, I don't know from where you got that the consumer organizations are thinking of filing a PIL. I am not aware of it. This may not be a case for PIL, but there is a case. You see, whenever there is a liberalization and if there is proper level playing field for the consumers, then deregulation is justified. I disagree with the comment of Mr. Padmanabhan that regulation is not necessary. In this, as far as banking service charges are concerned, and those 27 services which are identified by Sadashivan committee about reasonable of banking charges, they need to be looked into by Reserve Bank, because they were left for self-regulation through BCSBI, and it didn't materialize. For our last 11 years, it has not materialized well. And therefore, the regulator has to play its role, and therefore, as a central bank, RBI must play its role, and the basic banking service charges must be, RBI must come into the picture. I completely disagree on behalf of consumers with the view that RBI has no role to play as far as bank service charges are concerned, because the costing can be done well with the help of the other institutions which are expert in this by RBI itself, by nobody else.
Padmanabhan, I'm entirely with you that there should be no third-party intervention on charges. But banks on their part are not entirely fair. Take the instance, the argument that they will charge for transactions done at non-home branches. In these days of core banking, should there be a distinction at all between home and non-home branches? So shouldn't there be some check on banks, and who should do this?
No, Mythili, let me try and, finally, I think at the end of the day, we may end this interview with agreeing to disagree. I'm very conscious about that. But let me talk about the non-home. Not that I'm a great supporter of that. I have one strong view one way or the other. But please remember that every branch is sized based on its customer base. Now, if we are talking about a non-home, we have a case, without mentioning the name of the branch, I can tell you in Bank of India, we have a bank where during the first 3 days of the month, for remittance purpose, the customers that we serve increases by a factor of 10. If it is 100 normally, it is 100, 10 times 100 that happens during the first 3 or 4 days of the month. Do you think that any bank can manage that kind of infrastructure? So there is a rationale for saying that for non-home transactions, because of the convenience that is provided, if you are talking about costing, why does somebody go to a non-home? Because if my home branch is, let us say, 5 kilometers away, my cost of going to that branch and doing the transaction is going to be completely different from my going to a nearby non-home branch and do it. I'm saying that you could come back saying that that could be an extraordinary case, because why should I open a branch 5 kilometers away? But this, we are talking about migrant workers and coming to a branch and doing this transaction. So there is clear rationale for some of these decisions taken. Probably the banks must be more articulate in telling the customers, discussing with the customers, this is where the transparency comes in, why we have to do this. Otherwise, the bank's own branch customers will suffer during this time, and there again there will be a customer service complaint. So all these facts will have to be taken into account, although I don't say that I have very strong views about one way or the other.
Well, I'm afraid we'll have to end this discussion now as we've run out of time completely. Opinion is clearly divided, with Mr. Ravat opposing bank charges tooth and nail, and both the bankers, Padmanabhan and Rajnish, making a case for it on the grounds that freebies are no longer sustainable. But on that note, it's time for us to say goodbye, thank our experts and our viewers. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. In the meantime, if there's any issue that you'd like discussed in this program, do mail us at the email ID you see at the bottom of your screen.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.